My name is Edward Say. I'm a senior partner with Booz & Company. I'm also Booz & Company's chairman for Greater China. We do management consulting. Sure, I consult to my clients, and these are usually large companies, both foreign companies trying to operate in China, as well as Chinese companies who want to build their capabilities and sometimes expand outside of China. So I help with the business strategies and operations and so on. Sure. In my book called The China Strategy, I talk about four major themes. The first theme is open China, meaning, China has been trying to open itself up since the economic reform started by Deng Xiaoping in 1978. And over the last several decades, China has indeed continued to open up itself to the rest of the world and try to integrate itself into the rest of the world. And at the same time, there is a large-scale urbanization that's going on in China, where China is trying to turn itself into a largely urban society. And actually that would mean that there will be a new groups of Chinese consumers that will be emerging. And these new Chinese consumers will have the affordability of buying the products and services that many multinational companies or foreign companies would be selling into China. So that's the first theme. Second theme is what I call entrepreneurial China. That means, as I think as many of you know, Chinese very entrepreneurial. Historically, we are very good businessmen. But with the communist rule starting in 1949, for several decades, that entrepreneurship has been suppressed. But since the economic reform, the Chinese government is allowing the blossoming of the entrepreneurship, and today we're seeing all sorts of Chinese privately owned companies who are into various industry sectors, and many of them are doing really well. So this widespread dynamism that is caused by or is driven by the entrepreneurship is very pertinent in the Chinese society. The third theme that I talk about is official China, and as many of you know, the Chinese government has been taking a very major role in directing the development of the country, as in particular in the Chinese economy. And we have seen that over the years that the Chinese government has actually been able to direct the resources very effectively to areas that China needs, and in particular in laying the basic infrastructure for businesses to do the business more effectively. And the last theme, the fourth and last theme that I talk about was what I call One World. And increasingly what we're seeing is that for global companies, no longer China is just a place to do business. China is a growing market, a potential market, nor China is just a base for sourcing products and export back to their home countries. Increasingly, China is a base where companies need to do research and development, do product development, and then integrate the China operations into the global operations. So in other words, for global companies, we're recommending that they need to treat China, and for the matter India, as the core when they consider the global strategies. U.S. corporations have to recognize that China is indeed a very different place to do business compared to the U.S. or, for that matter, any other other places where the U.S. companies may be doing business with for a long time. The first thing that I would recommend the U.S. business to do is to have a deep understanding of what I call the Chinese context, the context in which you need to understand the Chinese history, the Chinese culture, just about the Chinese way of doing things. And for many U.S. companies, that is not, I don't think the companies have done well enough to have that deep understanding. I think a lot of American companies would assume that they can take whatever products or service offerings or business model that they have developed in the U.S. And they could directly apply those to China and expect that they will work in China. In reality, is not that easy. You need to understand the China market, the China context, and adapt your products and service offering to the local market. It is hard to predict precisely how the evolution is gonna sort of evolve. But if you look at the snapshot today and look at how the Chinese people are looking at the government, I say while obviously, just like people in another country, many of the Chinese people would have criticism towards the Chinese government. But by and large, with respect to the development, in particular economic development, that China has gone through in the last couple of decades, I would say the Chinese people has been very supportive of the Chinese government's policies and what they have been able to achieve in terms of lifting the living standards of the Chinese. Over time, one would expect that as the Chinese people become wealthier, and many of them will go outside of China, they become more wealthy. You would expect that there is going to be some more feedback from the Chinese people on how the Chinese government ought to be conducted. And in fact, within the Chinese government, they also do recognize that in fact things cannot be sort of stagnant, or it cannot be just stay where it is today. And there is always a lot of discussions within the Chinese government as to how the government ought to be changed over time. But unlikely we're going to see a drastic change overnight. We're probably going to see a gradual evolution. And in fact, right now, within the Communist Party, there's quite a bit discussion about the so-called internal democracy. In other words, creating some competition internally within the party on certain key posts of the assignments. And we expect this evolution will continue to happen. Yeah, certainly. Anytime you own money from other people, it's always an issue. I think it goes without saying at the country level as well. From the Chinese standpoint, Chinese obviously see that it's a way to invest their money. At the same time, Chinese also a bit concerned whether or not we're putting too much within one basket. But at the same time, are there any other sort of better alternatives? One also need to argue. So it's a bit of a tenuous situation. But Chinese always sort of reviewing or monitoring, how we should making our investments. I think most of the Chinese would expect that China will continue to rise in the next couple of decades, overall speaking, economically and perhaps geopolitically. For the Chinese, we believe that for centuries in the past, we've been in the center of the world. In fact, China in Chinese means the Middle Kingdom, that we are in the middle of the world. Rightly or wrongly, that's the belief. And so this is a current or recent rise of China is, for many Chinese, is just the way that we get back to where we ought to be. But the relationship between China and the rest world, in particular US, need to be kept within the context of what I talk about in my book, which is Open China. China actually is a relatively open society. China has tremendous motives of wanting to integrate into the rest of the world. And the relationship with the US, for example, I think, is a very different type of relationship compared to, let's say, the US and the Soviet Union relationship in the Cold War era, or even, when Japan was also rising in the 80s, the relationship in the US and Japan. I think today, if you look at China and US, a lot of interests are quite intertwined. There's a lot of mutual interests. Of course, there are differences as well. And that's a reason that's to be expected. But at the same time, there's tremendous amount of intertwined interest between the two countries, in particular in terms of businesses, that in fact, as China continues to rise, China will have to learn about how to play more effectively in the global geopolitical world. But at the same time, it's not like China would have to sort of threaten or sort of rival itself with the US. I don't think that is the motive. Actually, as China started its economic reform back in the late 70s, China was looking out to other economies to try to sort of learn from other economies about the experiences and so on, because China was really struck about how backward China was compared to the rest of the world. So the first series of economies that the Chinese were trying to learn from were Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, the so-called tiger states, and they learned something. And then the next stage of countries that the Chinese were trying to learn from were Korea, Japan, the so-called East Asian model. And then the first stage was, many of the Western countries, the Western European countries, America, and so on. And the Chinese were just, very curious about what worked and what did not work. And of course, every of these markets or countries or economies are very different because the context is very different. China is huge. China is, in a way, they start with a very low base. So how can China sort of accelerate this process? So China would need to learn from the very best from the rest of the world. And I say that, China has picked up very different things from different economies in the whole process of learning from these various economies. But one thing that is, in a way, is also quite shocking to the Chinese was what happened in the global financial crisis back in the late 2008. And to the Chinese, the abrupt collapse of the financial system and the collapse of many corporations in the West was a major shock to the Chinese. So it leaves some questions to the Chinese of, what is actually the best operating model? I don't think the Chinese also have figured it out, but we certainly have learned a lot during this process. Well, I can sort of comment on behalf of Google because, I think the Google business executives have a very clear mind about what they're doing. But I would only comment that, I think when we look at China and also the opportunities for foreign companies in China, I think we need to take a broader view and perhaps a longer view. The media sector where Google is in is a rather sensitive sector for the Chinese government for the reasons that I think everybody understands. And so, I think it is, in a way, is not unreasonable to see, the different perspective between a company like Google and that of the Chinese government. I cannot put a value judgment on who's right, who's wrong, but what my view is that is, only one of the data points within a broader universe of considerations. And in fact, for many companies that I work with and I talk to, many foreign companies, including many American companies, to continue to see tremendous opportunities in China, but also they see competitive threats coming out from China. So, companies are not very busy in sort of saying, what does Google mean to me? Companies are saying, what does China really mean to me in terms of both the opportunities as well as the threats or the challenges. So I say that, Google is an important case because it's highly visible, but at the same time, it's only one data point within numerous data points within the universe of companies doing business in China or with China. Well, I think, to what extent the Chinese will want to adjust the policies in this area, I think is, obviously that's what there's a decision that the Chinese government should make. With respect to Google, I think they will look at it from their business standpoint, to what extent they can be successful in China within the current regulatory context. And the fact of the matter is, for many of the foreign internet companies have been trying, to go into China and try to compete within the Chinese context. Many of the foreign internet companies find that it's actually pretty challenging because the local companies are actually fairly competitive. So that's a reality that, business is about competition. And when you're facing with strong competition, then, you need to be careful about, what's the next step. Should you want to continue to invest the resources to try to compete head-on with the other guys, or do you want to make a withdrawal? Then, it's a decision that every company needs to make. But the Chinese companies are very, very competitive in their own space. When I talk about nonlinearity, what I usually meant was, when you look at the demand side of things in China, you typically would see that, for some time there's maybe a gestation period. Things may be a little bit slow in terms of the pickup, but then all of a sudden you will see an uptake rapidly. That's what we call a discontinuity or an inflection point. And, over the years as we do consulting in China, we see that sort of discontinuities over and over again across many industry sectors. And so our recommendations for foreign companies is that, when you go into China, you cannot just take a snapshot of what's going on in China and try to extrapolate that, incrementally or linearly. That will be the case in the future. Oftentimes, you will miss the boat. And so we would recommend business people to go in with a mindset that, look, if we anticipate what will happen in China and what will be the basic drivers that will drive up the demand side, and then try to deeply understand how those drivers going to manifest and what the combination of the drivers' manifestation will actually mean to companies. So that's what we mean by nonlinearities. Yeah, both these cities are, leading cities in China. Of course, Hong Kong is outside of mainland China, is a special economic zone. But it's still officially is part of China. Hong Kong have had a, very successful history, as you know, over the last several decades, in particular under the British rule. And even after the handover from the British back to the Chinese, Hong Kong still retains many of the major elements of what the British have left behind, in particular in the legal system. So, the Hong Kong continues to be a major financial center for the region, and is underpinned by a very reliable and very transparent legal system. Whereas Shanghai clearly is the leading city in all of mainland China. It's grown tremendously since 20, 30 years ago, and today is a bona fide sort of cosmopolitan city, in many ways very similar to Hong Kong. But at the same time, it's still within the territory of mainland China. So many things Shanghai still need to sort of catch up, in particular on legal system and so on. But at the same time, Shanghai benefits from what I call in my book official China, that the Chinese government, as they sort of formulate a strategy, as they decide where to put the resources. In many cases, Shanghai is the beneficiary of these kind of national policies, and so the growth of Shanghai over the last couple of decades has been truly tremendous, and we will expect Shanghai to continue to integrate with the rest of the world over time. And so both Hong Kong and Shanghai are, for me, is tremendously interesting, and I'm very lucky to be able to live in both cities. As China, continues to rise, and perhaps India and a few other sort of so-called emerging markets, I think we're seeing a redefinition of the global geopolitical picture. I think, we will evolve more from a, single superpower to perhaps multiple power, maybe not superpower, but sort of multiple power picture, where everybody will seek to work with everyone else in a more closer manner. And I believe that, notwithstanding a lot of discussion about protectionism and people trying to protect this and that and so on, I believe the world will move towards perhaps a more globalized environment where countries will have to work closer together on a similar agenda. I think the U.S. will continue to play a major leadership role in many of these major geopolitical issues. I would expect countries like China, India, Russia, and of course many of the Western European powers will also play an important role. I think a large link to all this is the growth of the global multinational companies, that these companies will work across national borders. They will do businesses in various countries, and in some cases they will have to apply the global processes and systems. But in many cases, they also need to be very local. In places like the U.S., in China, Japan, and India, you have to be very local. So that ability to combine the globalness of companies as well as to become very local is going to be a real challenge of the leading multinational companies. But I am very optimistic that we're going to have quite a number of these companies who can be very successful, can sort of develop the right model to take advantage of the globalization that we'll be seeing over time.